Prior to this, he set foundations. So he went out into society, and you see, for example, when he was trading the Prophet, through his good character, through his fairness, people would see him trade and see that he was a fair person, he was a kind person, he was a generous person, and they would call him as-Sadiq and al-Amin, for example. We all know this. Or we look in other areas in the Prophet's life, and we see that, for example, when he was young, he sets up this organization, Hilf al-Fudul, where he's trying to bring social justice to people. So when they're going through difficulties or when they're going through issues in society, he's the one that's there to go to when you're having issues. Or in other narrations, we see people, for example, nowadays we've got banks. So if we've got possessions or things that we want to put away into storage, we have a place to put them. But when people would have these possessions, they'd have this wealth, they would take their possessions and their belongings to the Prophet to take care of. So we see that the Prophet, throughout his life, through these first 40 years, he's established himself in society as this honest person, as this just person, as this truthful person. And yet, despite all of these foundations that he's put in his life, he's being character assassinated as soon as he begins the mission, as soon as he starts the revelation. So we can see that perhaps the Prophet is feeling some form of anxiety, perhaps he's feeling some form of struggle in his life, that he's put these foundations down. People know what he's like, and yet, despite this, they're still calling him mad, they're still calling him deranged. And so Allah is reassuring the Prophet. He's saying that continue on the path that you're on. So when we look further into the verses, we see that Allah says, إن ربك هو أعلم بمن ضل عن سبيله وهو أعلم بالمهتدين. That Allah knows who are the transgressors and those who are guided. And Allah is constantly reassuring the Prophet. He's saying to him, don't yield to these people. So after this verse he says, فَلَا تُطِعِ الْمُكَذِّبِينَ. He says, don't yield to those transgressors. وَدُّوا لَوْ تُدْهِنُوا فَيَدْهِنُونَ. They try to soften you, so don't soften to them. So these individuals, they're trying to bribe the Prophet. They're trying to make him soften his stance. Despite all of this, so by slandering him, by accusing him, by saying that he's mad, by saying he's a sorcerer, they're trying to soften his position. They're trying to make him weaken. And the Quran saying that, no, you're on the right path. Stay strong, stay firm, and don't soften your stance to these individuals. Don't weaken yourself to these individuals. And they will try and seek from you to soften your stance. So we see so many examples in the Prophet's life where people would try to pay him and say that, forget the prophetic mission, forget this message, we'll give you a payout as long as you stop preaching to the people. Or you see other people that will say, I'll accept this religion, but with some conditions. For example, I want to continue worshipping this particular idol. So we see people constantly trying to soften the Prophet's stance, but Allah is telling the Prophet that don't listen to these individuals. You are on the right path and continue preaching your message. And this gives us a lot of encouragement because, often, particularly within a society and within a community like this one, where we see many people here within the audience, the scholars and the people that have studied, we often try within our household to bring people towards Islam because we see the beauty within it. We see the beauty within following this deen. And can you imagine what the Prophet went through to lay these foundations for 30 to 40 years of his life and then to be character assassinated at that moment in his life? But yet the Prophet continues. He continues with his great akhlaq. He continues by being good to the people. He continues by showing his morality, showing that he won't give up. And sometimes it's a lesson for us, because sometimes when we try, for example, to teach our children about the religion, or we teach our family members, our spouses, our extended family members, and sometimes after so much effort, we could go for a year, 2 years, trying to be good in our character, trying to be helpful in the house, and then suddenly one day we might just snap and we think, they're still not changing because of us, they're still not listening to us, they're still not taking on our advice. And the Prophet gives us the best of examples that despite all of this, despite all the foundations that he laid down, despite all the fact that he was constantly abused and cursed at, he still continues to show that great character and that great morality. So that's why we see, for example, when he's interacting with his uncle, like Abu Lahab, he's still continuing to, or people in the community, he's still continuing to visit them. He's still continuing, even though he's being insulted, he's being thrown curses at, he's even being physically abused, and yet he continues. So, inshallah, from this, we can perhaps take example from the life of the Holy Prophet and take this on board within our character, inshallah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, wal asr. Inna al-insana lafi khusr, illa alladhina amanu wa amilu as-salihat, wa tawasaw bil-haqq, wa tawasaw bis-sabr. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen, as-salatu was-salamu ala rasulillah wa ala ahli baytihi at-tayyibin at-tahirin, salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. So, continuing with this discussion, we see, for example, from the first few verses of Surah Al-Qalam, that Allah is reassuring the Prophet. He's given him that strength to continue, to keep going through the message. And when we look at the Mufassirin, a lot of them will say that, for example, the first few verses of the Surah are Meccan in nature, and then it suddenly shifts towards a Madani tone. So, despite this, we still see this kind of continuity within the Surah, and there's some nice points that you connect to as we read through the first few opening lines of this Surah. So, I wanted to just go into that a little bit further. But before we do that, the verses that we were talking about, so we saw about how these people were trying to make the Prophet soften his stance, to soften the way that he approaches himself with regards to them. And the Quran describes these individuals. It gives characteristics of these individuals and explains who these people are. So he says, for example, in the Quran after this, it says, and don't yield to the mean swearer, the defamer, the one going about with slander, the one the forbidder of good, or outstepping the limits, sinful, ignoble. So it gives characteristics of these individuals that are trying to defame the Prophet, that are trying to bring the Prophet down. And it's interesting because after giving this description of all these individuals' characteristics who are trying to bring the Prophet down, we wonder, why is it that they're doing this? And the Quran says, كَانَ ذَا مَالٍ وَبَنِينَ, because he possesses wealth and sons. So the possession of their wealth and their children has given this kind of arrogance. They think that they don't need anything else. They've got everything set in their life. They've got their family, they've got their friends, they've got their children. We don't need this message. We don't need this understanding. And we see this so many times, even within our Muslim societies, when you speak to people that have gone away from the religion, and they say that we don't need this advice anymore. We're living our life comfortably, we've got our kids, we've got our families, we're busy, we haven't got time for any of these things. So within the Quran, we see this here being reflected as well, that the wealth, the possessions that these people have made them a bit arrogant towards the Prophet, and they're trying to reject his call. And interestingly, as this surah goes on, the Quran gives a parable of individuals, and it says that we will try them as we tried the owners of the garden. And when they swore that they would certainly cut off the produce in the morning and were not willing to set aside a portion for the poor, then there encompassed it a visitation from your Lord while they were sleeping, so it became a black barren land. So many of the Mufassirin comment on what this means. What is this land? What is it talking about? And although there's a difference of opinions here, generally the idea is that there was an individual who had a piece of land and there was lots of produce growing on it. There was lots of fruits, there was lots of different produce that he would harvest every year. And before he would take the harvest for himself, this individual would give a portion, set aside a portion for the poor. He'd do this first and then he would take it to the rest of his family. And once this person, according to some reports, passed away, his family members, his children, took this land, and one year they had a harvest where it was better than any other harvest. They saw lots of fruits and different produce that they could take for themselves. And they decided between them, they whispered between them that we're going to take this produce this time. We're not going to give it to the poor. So let's go out early in the morning before anyone's awake. Let's harvest the land, take the produce and keep it for ourselves. So that when people come, they'll see that there's no produce and we've kept this produce for ourselves. And whilst they were sleeping, they had this idea to do this in the morning, and whilst they were sleeping, the land becomes destroyed by God overnight. And it's interesting because when we reflect on this and then compare it to the surah, the opening lines of the surah, we see that just like those people had this possessive tendency over their children and their property, and that led them towards arrogance, likewise, these individuals, they've inherited this land and they start to become greedy. They start to take the things for themselves. And particularly looking at these ayam, the Prophet's Mawlid coming soon, it's interesting to reflect upon this and then look at the way that the Prophet conducted himself. In that, particularly when you look at the hijrah, you look at this movement of individuals going from Mecca to Medina, and they're leaving behind all of their possessions, they're leaving behind all of their wealth, and they're just leaving on the spur of a moment to go to a different city, to go to a different person's house, someone that they don't know, and to live there and leave everything and leave all their belongings behind. So we can imagine what kind of difficulty these individuals went through. Imagine leaving everything behind that you have in this city, for example, in Birmingham, and then saying that you have to now make hijrah to a different country and leave everything behind and know that your possessions most likely will be taken away. They'll be usurped by someone else. So despite this, what does the Prophet do? How does he react in this situation? You see the Prophet, he takes the muhajirun and he pairs them up and takes them into people's houses and says to them that this person is your brother, this person is your sister, for example. And these individuals now have left their city and they're now living in a completely different house. Can we even imagine this? I mean, many of us sometimes have a panic attack or we have anxiety as soon as a guest comes over. But these individuals had to basically take an entire family within their home. And it makes you ponder, if the Prophet were to be here today and to see the situation that we have today with people crossing the borders, people drowning on their route into the UK, for example, how soft would we be in accepting individuals within our house? How do we go about even distributing our wealth? Do we even take a portion from our wealth and give it to those people that are in need? These verses make you reflect on how the Prophet conducted ourselves and how we and how myself conduct ourselves on a day-to-day basis. How do we go about our lives? Do we even take aside a portion? Furthermore, when we look at the Prophet's life in Medina itself, not only did he look after the Muhajirin, but he also created a constitution, the constitution of Medina, and he was looking after the people that were already there. So he's trying to create social cohesion amongst people. So he's not only looking after the people from his society, from his religion, from his town, but he's also looking after the people that perhaps don't conform to his religious values, that perhaps come from a different society completely, that come from a different moral code, but he's still looking after everyone. He's still concerned about all of these other individuals. And therefore, when we look at our lives, Sometimes we often focus on our people and our communities, on our immigrants, for example, people from my country, from Pakistan, from Afghanistan, from Iran. But do we look also not just at those people, but do we also look at home and see what can we do for these individuals that are in our houses, in our communities, in our countries as well? And are we helping those people, or are we discriminating on the fact that they don't identify in the same way that we do, that they don't hold the same religion that we do? So these verses and this reflection on the Prophet hopefully can serve as a reminder for us. Although it's a very simple reminder, but it's still a reminder that perhaps we can take a lesson from these verses. Perhaps we can look at the verses and reflect on the life of the Prophet and see whether there are certain things that we can do, very simple things that we can do to perhaps change ourselves, to perhaps change the way that we approach these situations, and also the way that we treat individuals. Because I want to finally end on this final point I was meant to make in the first khutbah, but sometimes when we go out, there's many people, even from within this institution, for example. When I was here for a number of years, and I met different people from different years and different courses and different walks of life. And many of these people were sincere. They just came to study a bit of religion. They just came to understand the deen a bit better. But as soon as they leave this institution, for example, an institution like this one, they're slandered, they're accused, they're labeled as people from the Al-Mahdi Institute, for example, people from a particular way of thinking. They're labeled as this group or this kind of people. But have we even asked these individuals what their views are, what their thought process is? How do they go about in their lives? Or do we just slander them just on the basis of them being tied to an institution, just on the basis of a message that is being given? Or do we try and speak to these individuals, try to get to know them, try to understand what they are about? Or does everything that these people have done throughout their life not matter anymore? And unfortunately, we see this even when we go out. We see so many people blacklisted almost because of being tied to institutions, blacklisted because of their viewpoints. But if we are unable to critically engage, if we're unable to speak to people on an intellectual level, then on what basis am I even slandering this person? On what basis am I even downgrading these individuals? So perhaps, inshallah, through these verses, we can reflect on the Prophet, we can take lesson from his life, and inshallah, before we end, actually to recite Surah Al-Fatiha for all of those people that are suffering within this country, from the borders that are coming in, people in different countries like Palestine, like Bangladesh, like Parachinar, all these different places where people are suffering on a constant basis. We pray with the Surah Al-Fatiha, and inshallah we hopefully can take message from and take lessons from the life of the Prophet in these days ahead and implement them within our character. Surah Al-Fatiha. Bismillah.